We are happy to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. José Aranda. He's here to share some of his story and to share his academic expertise. Dr. Aranda's visit is part of our ongoing celebration of Hispanic and Latino Heritage Month, and we are so excited that he has taken time to meet with us today. Dr. Aranda works at Houston's very own Rice University and is currently a member at Rice's English department, where he teaches courses in American literature and Chicano and Chicana literature. In addition, he is a director of undergraduate studies for the Department of Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American Studies. He is also one of the coordinators for the Mellon Ways undergraduate fellowship program at Rice. Dr. Aranda receives his PhD from Brown University and uses his knowledge to write books about the challenges people of different races have found coming into the United States. Dr. Aranda has written articles about early U.S. criticism, Mexican-American literature, and Chicano studies. He is currently working on recovering the Hispanic Literary Heritage Project, which is a national project dealing with preserving Hispanic culture in the United States. Dr. Aranda is a founding member of Chicano Leadership Rice, which helps staff and faculty on the Rice campus gain a greater understanding of the Chicano and Latino experience on campus and in the Great Houston area. One of Dr. Aranda's books, Why I Dreamed of Jeannie but Became a Chicano Instead, is written about how television, popular culture, the Vietnam War, and news media played a significant role in shaping the political and cultural identities of the first-generation Mexican-American children. We at the John Cooper Middle School are happy to welcome Dr. Aranda to our school and are truly lucky to have someone with such great cultural insight and academic knowledge meet with us today. Thank you, Dr. Aranda. Everyone, please join us in giving a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. José Aranda.
I'm going to come out more often to John Cooper because that's the best introduction I've ever had for anything I've ever done in my life. So thank you guys, you're wonderful. And many thanks to Ms. Marsha Elliott and Charles Williams for organizing and for all the staff and all of you for attending today. And I have a plan of sorts. It's a little bit fluid so that we can adjust according to my sense of your attention or your questions. And I really love questions. I don't always know what people are thinking, so the only way I know that if you ask me a question. So if at any point a question occurs, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll try to answer your question. And I'll definitely leave time in between the segments for questions. So let me start with a little bit of biography. You've heard most of what is out there in the public realm. I was born, though, in 1961, and up here is where I was born in Houston. Let me just pan out a little bit. This is called Magnolia Park. It's in the east side of Houston. I'm assuming most of you live on this side of the county, right? Here in the Woodlands, right? So you may not have had any reason to go down 45 and get off a Wayside Drive and make a left on Wayside and go down Wayside all the way to Canal Street and then make a right. And as soon as you're at Wayside and Canal Street, that's my old home, or old neighborhood. Back in the day, neighborhoods where I came from were called barrios, or sometimes colonias. Barrios is a Spanish word for neighborhood. And this is where my parents landed in 1960 when they immigrated from Mexico. They immigrated from Monterrey, Mexico, which is the northern part of Mexico. And my dad had a job as a machinist. He was trained as a machinist, basically at a vocational school in Monterrey. And what's interesting about my father's story about how he entered the United States is that he was one of hundreds and hundreds of young men who had been trained as machinists and who were hired at that point in Houston. And they were hired precisely because Houston was going through a huge development in the oil and gas industry. And all of you know how important oil and gas is to the city of Houston, to Harris County, to the whole state of Texas. And so men like my father were part of that big push There was another interesting kind of legal part that happened at the end of the Eisenhower administration, and just before John F. Kennedy became president. The quotas, immigration quotas for this kind of work loosened up. There were more slots. So my dad was one of those men that occupied that kind of work and labor. And when he came to Houston, he came to Magnolia Park. And one of the reasons he found work there, and I'm sure you know about this, is that the proximity of the, went too far, of the Chip Channel. And I'm not sure how much you know about the Houston Chip Channel, but the Houston Chip Channel is a vital part, has been a vital part of commerce and business and trade for the city of Houston and for this part of Texas for decades. Some of you might know that the Houston Chip Channel had to be dredged back in the teens in order to allow for ships, cargo ships, to enter the port. Before then, there was no port of Houston. The closest port was the more obvious port, the port of Galveston. Within a few decades, though, the port of Houston became so important that it actually eclipsed the amount of tonnage that goes through Galveston, and to this day, that's the case. Well, for the oil industry, I'm telling you all this because this is exactly why my family immigrated and why my generation of immigrants from Mexico came. The oil patch had to deliver materials, not just to the Gulf of Mexico, but internationally. So as you also may know, Houston is the center for all the global research, technology, and business part of the oil industry, oil and gas industry. So not surprising, having access to transportation is really important in to provide this infrastructure. So my father's generation worked here in Magnolia Park, and there were all sorts of machine shops, small machine shops, making tools, making parts. There was also a pipe fitting company. And so this was where there was work, and people immigrate, as usually they do since the 19th century, wherever there's work. As in most Hispanic communities, especially those of Mexican descent from my generation, most people were raised Catholic, and the majority of raised Catholic tried to live in places where there was a Catholic church. And so my family was no different. And this is, I'm showing you a picture of Immaculate Heart of Mary, and this was the Catholic Church, the primary Catholic Church in this part of Houston. So I was born in 1961. I was born 2 or 3 weeks after a famous hurricane hit Houston, Hurricane Carla. And I'm only telling you this because this is how stories are told in families around different events. And so my parents tell me and continue to tell me how they had to evacuate their home and go to Edison Middle School in Magnolia, and not too far from Immaculate Heart of Mary. Just speeding up a little bit, my parents had 3 other children, so I have 2 brothers and a sister. One brother is a high school teacher. He teaches at Bel Air High School. I have a brother who is an accountant, and then my sister is a communication officer in Judge Edmonds' office for the county. So I think we're all done fairly well. We continue to live here in the city of Houston, and my parents continue to live as well. What should I tell you? Where to go from here? All right. How was it? So I'm 55 years old. So 55 years ago, Houston and Harris County were very different. 55 years ago, it's safe to say there was nothing called the Woodlands, although I think the planning for the Woodlands was in the 60s. I don't think it was somewhere in the mid to late 60s. So this whole community was among very early planned communities in the United States. In fact, in some ways, the Woodlands has always set the standard for certain kind of community building. So back then, in 1960, many things were happening. One of the things that happened in 1960 was the election of John F. Kennedy. And you may remember from your, especially since you're in 7th grade, you're taking Texas history, you remember Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a longtime senator from Texas, but then became the vice president with JFK. Now, JFK did one thing really important for the entire nation, and that was in 1961, the fall of 61. He came to Rice, and he delivered a really important speech about the space program. And in 61, he basically said, we're going to put a person, he called it men, we're going to put a man on the moon. And it was in a decade. And so he set what was then called something about the frontier, I forget the phrase right now. But the whole initiative, a national initiative, was set in 1961 and was announced in Houston. Why Houston? Well, because Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president, had made arrangements for NASA to have its mission control near Houston, what is now Clear Lake. And part of what he had organized was that Rice University would lease actually the land on which NASA sits. Now, all this sounds perhaps a little too kind of abstract to you, but the issue about NASA in Houston and the oil and gas business is that it brought together all sorts of new attention to the city of Houston. In so many ways, the modern Houston that you see today, even the formation of Woodlands, precisely originates in that moment. Now, NASA had such a huge impact in the entire city for the obvious reason that people were enamored with the idea of space flight, astronauts, mission control, all that. It's obvious. What people didn't understand until it started to roll out is how important NASA was to education from K through 12 to university. And slowly but surely the educators became aware that NASA and the city of Houston were tied as much as they were tied to the oil and gas industry. For growing up Mexican American, this was also really important to me as well, because it gave us, all the children, a sense of what we can do with our education. And so every year there was endless trips to NASA, and perhaps some your teachers or staff here can remember those days, those of you who are from the Houston area. And believe it or not, it was very motivating to stay in school, to learn to do your math, science, biology, because these were the important heroes of our time in the 60s. At the same time in the 60s, that you might remember from your history books, it was a time of great social, not only upheaval, but social change. And so we had the civil rights movement that was going on, and the civil rights movement had different parts to it. There was the African American movement, which is in some ways the most known aspect of the civil rights movement, but there was also a Mexican American part that was referred to as the Chicano movement. And there was also an Asian American part and a Native American part as well. And other kinds of movements in the 60s also originate there as well. The environmental movement began in the 60s, for example. Houston was part of that change in many ways because it was also already moving in these economic and technological advancements, economic in terms of the oil and gas, technological in terms of NASA, and the whole idea of moving a nation to be prepared to be part of this advancing technology, spacefaring. So one of the things that had to happen, though, for everyone to participate in this initiative that John F. Kennedy put into motion was to create an environment for all people of diverse backgrounds to participate in. And so one of the places that took hold was in education. And so back in the 60s, education looked very different than it does today. You had your public schools, you had your private schools, but because of certain long-term systemic structural problems, especially around race and ethnicity and language, not everyone had the same access to school that they do now. I grew up, for example, back in Magnolia, and here, go back to the map. I grew up here in Magnolia, and Houston and Harris County didn't have any kind of Jim Crow laws, and I know some of you have been studying Jim Crow laws per se, but it had what we call de facto Jim Crow laws, where it was understood, culturally understood and culturally maintained that people should live in certain places and other people should live in others. So there was segregation. And what segregation basically meant is that you couldn't really always travel to certain parts of Houston or access certain institutions. And so if you were Hispanic or Mexican American, that's the vast majority of Hispanics are in Houston, you tended to live in barrios like Magnolia, right here, or, I'm trying to move it. Doesn't want to move, okay. Here we go. The second ward was another barrio, not too far from Magnolia. Another barrio over here, Denver Harbor. And just north of Houston, the north side, it was another barrio right here. These were the traditional barrios. And these were all places that my family would travel through for church events or because of friends, parties and that kind of thing. These days, Hispanics live in many parts of the city. They don't live necessarily in these traditional barrios anymore, although they can, of course, they continue. So, that meant that your worldview, right? Your worldview depended very much on the friends and neighbors you had in these neighborhoods. And the way you access information, the way you access knowledge about the world was through your schooling, but also to the television. Now, you may find this difficult to believe, but back in the 60s, early 70s, there were no cell phones, right? There was no internet. And one of the funniest things that people always I always try to entertain people with is the idea that the telephone is drastically different these days. Back in the day, you had dial phones. How many people have seen dial phones? How many people have ever used dial phones? Really? Oh, you used a dial phone? Okay, I'm impressed. I love the dial phone. When I was growing up, and we were exactly your age, we had a trick. Who can most quickly dial a phone number using a dial phone? And you got really quick manipulating the numbers. It was you were considered a very cool family if you had a push-button phone. So dial phones, back in the early 70s, computers existed. Computers have existed since the 50s, but there were no personal computers. And so the most advanced machine you had in your house, perhaps, was an electric typewriter, for example, or your car was the most advanced technology that you accessed on a daily basis. Today, you have your cell phones, you have your laptops, you have your iPods, you have all sorts of ways of accessing information. You can have, even these days, cars come in with their own computers, and computers, they do this funny thing about talking to you now. They can talk to you, you can talk to it, you can ask your questions, and they answer. All that's really bizarre. But in some ways, all that kind of technology and accessing information was the stuff of science fiction back in the 60s and the early 70s, things that have become true today. Now, why am I talking about information? Because the way you all, as individuals, access information, it makes the world seem very accessible. So you can go on the internet and travel through the internet, any part of the world. You can retrieve information about penguins in Antarctica, or the polar bears in the North Pole. But when we were young, the way we handled information was literally through libraries and encyclopedias and books. You had to access it in a very tactile way. And so again, access to information is not what we have now. It was very structured. And so one of the things that happened in the 60s in terms of the civil rights period is to making education accessible, information accessible to students. Not all K through 12 public schools were accessible to students, so they had to come The law had to come into effect to open up K through 12. Not all universities, for example, were accessible to students. I've been working at Rice University now for 22 years. But in the history of Rice, the civil rights movement was very important. It may be a surprise to people to hear this, but I think it's a good story in the end, that when Rice was founded back in it opened its doors in 1912, 1913, it was chartered, it was created as a university for the white men, young white men of Texas, and that's who went. The women did too, but it was chartered for young white men. So in the mid-60s, Rice had to go to court in order to, what they say, break the charter, to change the way they admitted students. And thankfully that happened. There was lots of people who pressed for that to change, and the university has never looked back on that. And now when you go to Rice University, there's a lot of different kinds of students, from not just from the United States, but internationally as well. So one of the themes of my life has been riding the wave of accessing education, accessing institutions. And so I went from this small, somewhat segregated neighborhood in Houston, Texas, of an immigrant family. And my parents really pressed education. I'm sure all your parents are also always pressing about that as well. And I got lucky though. I had very good teachers. And not all my teachers were Hispanic. In fact, Hispanic teachers were few and far to find. Most of my teachers were Anglo teachers, at times African American teachers as well. And they took an interest in me. Just like your teachers and your staff people here take an interest in you. And what was important about that kind of interest, as you might suspect, when you grow up in a world that's very small, feels small and segregated, is that when people take an interest in you, you make a decision to say, okay, I will believe them. Someone really wants me to succeed, or someone likes me, for example. I had teachers who helped me learn how to read, had teachers who took an interest so I would have better math scores, even teachers who taught me, and I was the worst student for this, trying to teach me something about music. But that kind of caring happened at every level. So I went from a public school in Magnolia to a parochial school. Catholic parishes sometimes would have parochial schools. And so I went through grade school and middle school and a Catholic school, and then I went to an all-male high school in Houston, St. Thomas High School. Some of you might have heard of that. And then from high school, I got very lucky that I had very good teachers, and I fell in love with literature. And it was a moment in my life when I decided that other things weren't that interesting. Like, it just wasn't as interesting as reading books. And so I started reading at 12 years old, and I kept reading. In many ways, the reason I'm a college professor, not just because I teach in the English department, the way I figured out who I was in the world was just through reading. And I continue to read to this day. In fact, I brought a bunch of books to it. And if I have time, I'll bring out some of the books that I teach, and of course I've read. So I went from high school to college, and one of the things that was happening in the late 70s and early 80s is that colleges were recruiting students just like myself, students of color, whether you were from Texas or California, whether you were brown or black or Asian, they were recruiting. And I got recruited to go to Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, and some of you have perhaps have traveled through the Northeast, New York, Connecticut, Boston. And as you might imagine, in 1980, the world was very different back then. Even though it was, well, let me just put it this way. In 1980, we still didn't have cell phones, we didn't have laptops. We had fancy new technology called a Walkman. Anybody ever heard of a Walkman? Who are you kids? Boy, that's amazing. So a Walkman was like, for college kids, that was the most interesting piece of technology because you can listen to music, right? Individually. And And so it was like the size of your current 6S iPhone. It was that size, and you could put a cassette in it. You had little headphones, and you can be your private little world listening to music. And so in some ways, that was the most advanced form of personal technology people had then. In 1980, there was a big election, and I voted for the first time. We have a big election coming up in November. In 1980, the incumbent president was Jimmy Carter, and the candidate challenging Jimmy Carter was Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan won that election back in 1980. From college, I had a great experience there. I won't tell you too many stories. I won't tell you any stories about college, but I will move on. I taught high school. Maybe I'll tell the teachers later. I returned to Houston, taught high school. I wanted to figure out an important thing about myself, which is, since education had been such a feature, such a theme of life, could I be a teacher? I really felt like I had gotten that far because of all the teachers in my life. And was there something about me that could give back in terms of teaching? So I tried teaching high school. I went to teach at Straight Jesuit College Preparatory, which is the rival high school of St. Thomas. It was a little strange to be in my rival high school, but there was a job. It was my first job, and there's nothing, let me tell you, you're all in 7th grade, but at one point there's nothing like getting a paycheck. It changes your life. And so it was my first real job, and I enjoyed teaching, but I figured out that I needed to learn more. So I went back to school, and I went to Brown University, which is in Providence, Rhode Island. I really liked the Northeast. And I went to an English department to get a PhD in English. Somewhere in there, in that experience of being a graduate student, I figured out that I really wanted to pursue American literature. And for a long time, I thought I would just study the 19th century and focus on people like Hawthorne or Melville, or Poe. And for a long time, I thought I would just focus on Hawthorne. But then eventually, your life brings new experiences. And I decided that another theme of my life had been being Mexican-American. And it wasn't clear to me how one could be Mexican-American, teach literature, and somehow pursue something meaningful. And at that time, by that point it's 1986, by that point there had been enough publication of people, of writers of Mexican descent, that I started to notice that there was, a corpus, an archive of literature. And so I made a decision, without any real models at Brown University, that I was going to pursue Mexican-American literature as a field of study. And so what is Mexican-American literature? And that's one of the things I had to ask myself and read books and articles in order to then finish my dissertation and then begin my job, eventually landing here at Rice University. And so I think I'll pause right now, since now I'm at Rice University. I came to Rice University in 1994. I'll pause right there to see if there's anyone who has a question. And teachers, staff, if you want to have a question, you can ask too. Yes?
What was your favorite books when you started reading a lot?
When I was 12 years old, I should say that my earnest reading began reading comic books. My brothers and I were avid comic book collectors. And so all of you are the beneficiaries of people like me back in the 70s who bought so many comic books from Marvel Comics. So all the movies that you're seeing now, like Captain America or the Avengers, it's because of people like me who supported the industry for so many years buying those comic books. But then eventually I moved on to read what was considered serious at the time, like Shakespeare. I would read I was like odd young man. I would read Dostoevsky. I think you might have heard of Dostoevsky. I I would read Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. I was a little bit of I had a dark streak when I was 12 and 13. I thought the world was a little difficult to understand, so I gravitated to kind of serious literature like that. And I just kept reading, and as I got educated by teachers, I understood what made a difference. What's the difference between someone like Herman Melville or Hemingway, for example. So, yeah. Then I just kept reading. Yeah, I don't read Shakespeare anymore. I'm past Shakespeare, but it was a good moment. Hey, another question before I move on. Yeah. In 1960, I think 1960, my dad, like I said, there was a push to get people like my dad, who was a trained machinist, into the labor market here in the United States, and so he applied for what they called back then a green card, which is a legal way of entering the United States. And what? It's like a work. It's been like a work visa. Yes, that's right. Yeah. And because of that, my mom was able to apply for a green card. So they came with papers. But it's an interesting point that not everybody then or now crossed the border documented. Tons of people will cross the border undocumented. Because one of the things about immigration in the 20th century and the 21st century is that the economics, global economics, work in a fluid way. And so where jobs are available, people will come. And sometimes jobs are filled by people from one's own country, but then sometimes jobs are filled by people from other countries. And most nations have rules about immigration, but there's also, what happens is people have great needs, and they sometimes will not follow those rules in order to satisfy those great needs. Some of them are very basic needs like food and housing, a desire for their children to have a good education, things like that. That's a great question. There was someone behind you, yes? Oh, okay. This is a serious question. So I had lots of favorites. I was very much a boy back in the 70s with my brother, so I loved Conan the Barbarian. I have to admit to that. Captain America, the Avengers. We collected a lot. We would just work or find money somehow, quote unquote, find money, and we would just go to the store. Yes. Yes, Superman's been around since, I guess, the 20s or 30s, I think, right? But I never really gravitated to Superman for different reasons. Well, one reason is that Superman was one of those early comic book characters that actually made it into television. And so there was a famous Superman series in the 50s, and this fellow named Reeves was Superman. And whenever I saw it on TV through reruns, it looked really fake, and I just thought it was too corny. So Conan the Barbarian was much cooler. It's definitely Captain America was cool. Oh, Spider-Man, yeah, that too. All right. Let me tell you a little. I want to tell you a little bit. Give you a few numbers to deal with, and we can come back to other questions. I want to give you a sense of what it means, why we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. So the U.S. Census Bureau does a lot of wonderful work on demographics, right? Demographics is a study of populations. And when you study a population, you can break it down into different categories of interest. For example, how many people who are male live in the United States, female? How many people who are of Anglo-American descent, Hispanic versus African American? So you get a lot of data. So one of the things that the Census Bureau has been doing for a while is collecting data on Hispanic communities. And every new Hispanic Heritage Month, they put out profile where they've collected it. So it gives you a little history about why this is celebrated in September. Maybe you already know this. In September 1968, Congress authorized President Lyndon B. Johnson to proclaim National Hispanic Heritage Week, observed during the week that included September 15th and September 16th. In 1989, Congress expanded the observance to a month-long celebration of the culture and tradition of those who trace their roots in Spain, Mexico, and the Spanish-speaking nations of Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. September 15th is the starting point for the celebration because it is the anniversary of the independence of 5 Latin American countries: Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. In addition to Mexico and Chile celebrate their independence days on September 16th and September 18th. So in many ways, the government was trying to capture who are Hispanics in the United States. Now, I want to draw attention to some of the numbers that you will find on this what they call facts on file. So you see that first number up there, can you see? Yeah, 56.6 million people is the number of Hispanics who live in the United States as of 2015. Now, this is how I teach my college students and even graduate students. And so I'm going to go through some of these numbers and ask you questions, right? All right. So one of the most important questions to ask anyone during this month is, who do you think, or what do you think is meant by the term Hispanic? What is Hispanic? I just read a little definition from the Census Bureau, who's Hispanic. But there's ways that term gets a little loose and people kind of get fuzzy about it. And so if I say Hispanic, you would say, and I ask you, what are some characteristics? You say, what's one characteristic of Hispanic? Yes. Yes, there's a great tendency to speak Spanish, although not all Hispanics speak Spanish, which is also okay. Yes? I like that. Yes, that's a non-technical term, characteristic, but yes, Hispanics are hardworking. True. All right, so you're hardworking, Spanish-speaking, or non-Spanish-speaking. What else? In terms, oh yes, go ahead. Yes, so the definition, even Spain, that's certainly true. Okay, so we have Spanish-speaking, hardworking, origin is a Spanish-speaking country, yes. Or from Latin descent. So one of the things that happens with the terms that we use in this country is sometimes you will hear people will be referred to as Hispanic, or the alternative is Latino or Latina. And it comes from the idea that the language, Spanish, is a Romance language, and when we call it a Romance language, Spanish is related to what other Romance languages? French, Italian, right? What? Yes, Portuguese, very good. And Romanian, very nice, even Romanian. So the whole idea that it comes from the Latin, right? All these Romance languages are popular versions of Latin. And so, in a technical sense, when you say Latino, Latina, any people from these Romance languages can also technically be considered Latino, Latina. But this is why Hispanic, in some cases, is preferred to Latino, Latina. Now, the interesting thing about terms like Hispanic or Latino is that they also have other regional, people have regional ways of self-identifying as Hispanic. So, for example, here in Texas, if you're of Mexican descent, you can be Mexican, Mexican-American, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, and then what else? There's another term that tends to be used. Yes? Chicano, that's right. Chicano, and I'll explain in a minute what a Chicano is. And that's very good. What else have you heard? There's at least one other word. Starts with a T. Tejano. How many people have heard Tejano? A couple? Yeah. So Tejano comes from comes from Texas, and as you all know, Texas comes from Tejas, right? And Tejas was the indigenous name for the region, right? So Tejano is another word. Now Chicano is a term that came up through the Chicano movement in the 60s, and Chicano literally means someone who is of Mexican descent, but who has a kind of activist outlook or activist upbringing, or relates to being of Mexican descent within a kind of broad, understood activist attitude. That wasn't very good. I'll try to fix that later. All right. Continuing with Hispanic. When I ask you to tell me about Hispanics, and I ask you to tell me what are some characteristic phenotypes of Hispanics, you would say what? I'm trying to test you here. What's a phenotype? Anybody ever crossed that word? Yes.
We have talked about that, but physical characteristics, what something looks like.
Yes, the physical characteristics, what someone looks like. It's otherwise race, right? So when I ask you Hispanics and ask you about race, what races are Hispanics a part of? When you look at me, what color am I? It's the light, I think. No, I'm not white. I'm brown, yeah, I'm brown. So I'm a brown-looking person. So Hispanics typically are represented in television, the media, the movies as brown, right? And in some ways, that's the majority phenotype that exists out there for Hispanics. But there are other Hispanics. So if I say to you there are white Hispanics, you say, yeah, sure, there are white Hispanics. Like, for example, who's a white Hispanic? Yeah. You're a white Hispanic? Excellent. There are white Hispanic? Yes. What? Which Gomez? Oh, yeah, Selena Gomez. Yeah, that's right. She is white. And then there's the other young woman. Yeah, there are a lot of white Hispanics. All right, so that's good. All right, so if I say to you, Hispanics can also be of African descent, and then so we have Afro-Hispanics as well. Who's a good example of Afro-Hispanic? Think right now. There have been many baseball players. Of course, I'm forgetting all their names. Who? Roberto Clemente is Puerto Rican, yes, of African descent, yes. All right, so here we go. One of the things that people constantly forget is that Hispanics come from different racial backgrounds. So you have brown-looking Hispanics, you have black-looking Hispanics, you have white-looking Hispanics, and then you also have Asian Hispanics as well. And so when the category Hispanic is tossed around, it's actually a complex term, or the people who are represented by that are complex. The other thing to say about Hispanics is that Hispanics come from occupy different, not only social classes, working class, middle class, owning class. Hispanics also observe different kinds of faith. And so you could be a Catholic Hispanic, a Protestant Hispanic, you can be a Jewish Hispanic, you can be agnostic, right? There are also Buddhist Hispanics out there as well. So this is one of the things to keep in mind, that when the media reduces people to one kind of Hispanic, you are often in the realm of ignorance. So don't be ignorant. All right, thank you. That was good. Going back, let me tap this so we go back to these demographics. There we go. All right, look at that number, 56.6 million. That's the rough estimate by the Census Bureau how many Hispanics in the United States. This is out of a population of 321.4 million people. So just a little bit over 320 million people in the United States. And so that means that Hispanics are roughly 18% of the total population. In an everyday sense, what does it mean that you have 18% Hispanics in a U.S. population? So in a class, yes? We're getting very close to that. Yeah, yes. Exactly. So if you have a room full of 100 people, 18 people would be Hispanic, right? Yes. Yes, and in fact, that's one of the fun facts. It is a fun fact, and so we have close to 40 million Spanish speakers. You guys have a very good teacher here. In fact, so many Spanish speakers in the United States that if you just would put all those 40 million in one room, they would constitute a country that is the second largest country of Spanish speakers, only second to Mexico, which has 160 million, I think. So this is very important in terms of thinking, how do you think about Hispanics in the United States? All right, moving down to the next one. 100.2 million, the second one, the number of Hispanic added to the nation's population between July 2014 and July 2015. This is means that this group is adding more to the population at a big rate. Up here, in 2016, demographers predict that the Hispanic population in the United States will reach 119 million, and that they will constitute 28.6% of the nation's population by 2016. Meaning that we're getting close to a third of the population in 2016. So in your lifetime, right? In your lifetime, by the time you hit 2016, practically 1 in 3 people will be Hispanic or have a Hispanic heritage. That's a lot of people, right? That's a lot of change. That's a huge change. Here's a little bit of data on Texas. 10.7 million, almost 11 million, is the population of Hispanic origin here in Texas. You may wonder what is the current population of Texas, and I looked it up. It is 2.2 million people. So if the total of Texas is 28.2, and Hispanics make about 11 million, Anglos are about 11 million, African Americans are about just over 3 million, and close to 2 million are other, which is a catch-all for Asian populations, I think. So if you just look at the numbers for Anglos and Hispanic, they're virtually the same, right? And why are these numbers important? Well, these numbers are important because eventually you have to think about social issues that are related to these numbers. And just as I was talking about the 60s in terms of institutions, access to institutions, one of the things that teachers are really interested in these numbers of children and how these children get older, access education, and become part of the workforce as well. So they have real significance in a short time. Let's see, moving on. So there's a number 9 there. Number 9, these are the states with a population of 1 million or more Hispanic residents. So that includes states like Arizona, California, Colorado, Florida, Illinois, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, and Texas. The next one down, 54.5%. This is the percentage of Hispanic population that live in California, Florida, and Texas. So just 3 states alone, over 50% of Hispanics live in these 3 states. So if you decide to leave Texas, but go live and work in California, you're going to encounter more Hispanics. You might feel comfortable there because you're used to that. Or if you go to Florida, you might feel like, oh, this is not all that different. Let's see. All right, I'm going to move down. All right, you already got the data on the Spanish language. So close to 40 million people speak Spanish in the United States. Here's some interesting facts, data on income, poverty, and health insurance. So the median income for Hispanic households is $42,491. The median income for a U.S. citizen in general is just over $53,000. And so this is where these numbers start to make sense in terms of making policy, in terms of domestic policy, social policy. The poverty rate for Hispanics is at 23.6. The average in the U.S. is 13.5, meaning that over 10% more people of Hispanic descent live under poverty, the poverty level. That's a huge difference. There's 19.9% of Hispanics who like health insurance, right? There's a lot of talk about Obamacare, health insurance, access to medical facilities. So close to 20% like health insurance. The average overall is 10.5. So again, this is a bad number, right? We want the numbers to go down. If you are in the health profession or in the insurance profession, you'd like to see more people get coverage, right? Moving to education. 65.3% of Hispanics aged 25 or older had at least a high school education in 2014. The overall percentage is 86.3%. So one of the things that you're not aware of when you're in 7th grade is that you're not aware of how many people are paying attention to who you are as students and how you accomplish certain educational goals. So people who accomplish or don't accomplish high school get counted. And so there's about a 20% difference between Hispanic students finishing high school versus the population at large. That is a big difference and a big problem. The percentage of Hispanic population age 25 or older with a bachelor's degree, that is someone who finishes college or university, is 14.4%. The average is otherwise 29.3%. So again, this almost twice as less is happening in the Hispanic population. Here's an interesting one. I'm just going to give a couple more and then I'll move on. 4.4 million, the number of Hispanics, I already did that one. Okay. 1.4 million, the number of age Hispanic, 25 or older with an advanced degree, master's, professional, or doctorate. So this one is really important to me as a college professor. When I teach undergraduates, but I also have graduate students. So among all the Hispanics in this country, only 1.4 million people have degrees higher than a bachelor. That is a master's degree or an MD or a JD, a law degree, or a PhD. And so if we go back to an earlier stat there's 18% Hispanics in the country, but only 1.4 of those 18% have higher degrees, then there is a gap, right, in terms of thinking of the future. If you go back to the fact that we have almost equal number of Anglos and Hispanics in Texas, 11 million. In a few years, though, the vast majority of people in Texas won't be Anglo-Americans, but will be Hispanics and others. And what's important for teachers, educators, and politicians to pay attention is that eventually people grow up and they become the members of society that are in charge of running the country, running the county, running the city, running schools. And so if this is a big population group, Hispanics, then we need to figure out ways to improve the educational rates for Hispanics because they will be the people, the generation that needs to lead things. Otherwise, certain kinds of inequities will continue if we don't do that. So I've been working steadily to improve the PhD part. I've graduated students of Hispanic descent. in the English department, and I continue to do that work and encourage other students to pursue PhDs. Okay. Then I'll pause right here. See if there's any question about these numbers. Okay. Yes.
Well, sort of related perhaps to these numbers, I think I heard you on a radio program with Tony Garza, Latino Hispanic José, perhaps. And one thing I remember from that is that Arizona has sort of a different way of talking or not showing the Spanish, the Latino heritage in their literature. Can you say just a little bit about that?
Sure. So one of the things that is exciting on one end but frustrating on the other is the fact that in Latino literature, there's a lot of Latino literature to focus on. If you're a person who wants to study it, be a teacher, whether you're teaching Latino literature in high school or middle school, high school, or in college, there's a lot of material to draw from. That's the exciting part. But if you are looking to see how that literature is incorporated in curriculum from K through 12 or college and university, then you get frustrated because you don't really see that kind of structural investment in literature that is in courses or people who are teaching it. And so it gets a little frustrating there. But in terms of just the literature and thinking about Hispanics through literature, you have to realize that Hispanics in the United States have been writing literature since the colonial period. So here's a different kind of way of thinking about Hispanics. So when does a colonial period begin? This is a kind of trick question. When does the colonial period begin in what we end up calling the Americas? Yes. A little earlier. It's a trick question. We just celebrated it on Monday. Yeah, 1492. Yeah, correct, right? So when Columbus took off on his 3 ships, as you know the story, he wasn't trying to find what ended up becoming the Americas. He was just trying to find a short route to Asia for the trade with Asia and Europe. But he found the Americas. Now, 1492 is important because of all the changes that happened thereafter. And soon, on the heels of Columbus' first and second voyages, people started to settle from Europe. And it had a lot of consequences for the native populations. But we can go into that at some point, perhaps. But they started to bring over the technology at the time for printing things, the printing press. And the printing press had been basically the kind of printing press we think of had been more or less invented two generations before. And so shortly after the Europeans come to the Americas, they start to print things, proclamations, documents, and eventually what we call literature. And so when we think of Hispanics and we think of literature had been produced by Hispanics in the Americas since the 1500s. So there's a long tradition of writing by Hispanics since then. Now in the United States, writing by Hispanics more or less begins in 1776, right? And then the Constitution gets ratified in 1784. And then the vast majority of what's available to us as students or scholars is from the 19th century on. Where I, as a professor, as a critic and a scholar, locate myself is thinking about Mexican-American literature as it originates from 1848 to the present. And this is where it dovetails a little bit with your Texas history. You remember that the Texas War of Independence began in what year? 1835, right? And it got concluded in 1836, right? And so Texas seceded from Mexico, right? In 1836, when its independence. But Mexico, as as a country didn't exist until more or less 1821. Before then, it was all Spanish. And so it was Spanish, it was indigenous first, native, and then Spanish, and then Mexican, and then here in Texas, right, the Republic of Texas. But then in 1846, there was a conflict, a war, right, between the U.S. and Mexico, the U.S.-Mexican War. And that lasted roughly 2 years. By the conclusion of that war, what we think of as the Southwest, that is from Texas to New Mexico to Arizona to California and parts of Colorado, all those territories were ceded to the United States because of the treaty in 1846. So I, many others, mostly think of Mexican-American literature from 1848 to the present. And there's a lot of material there. So among the very earliest novels written by a person of Mexican descent in English is actually was published in 1872. And I have a copy of that book here. The next one by same author was 1885. So when we think about this long history, it is involved with these political events, military wars, conflicts, and then you have the history of the printing press as it entered different colonial spaces, Texas versus California. But in general, there's just a lot of material. This is a long kind of way of saying that most people didn't become aware of Hispanic literature until the Civil Rights period. And that was kind of a flourishing of writers, and it got national attention. So you had people like Tomás Rivera or Rodolfo Anaya, who wrote Bless Me Ultima, and maybe some of you have read Bless Me Ultima. And in the 80s, you have more writers who have become more popular, like Sandra Cisneros, The House on Mango Street, for example. But nowadays, we have so many more writers and authors that are very difficult to keep track of. And one of the reasons it's difficult to keep track of is because Hispanic writers are entering all sorts of genres that are very popular. So you have writers doing the typical novels for adults. You have writers who do young adult novels, people writing just for your age group. You have people who do science fiction. You have people who do detective literature, and everything in between, comic books as well, actually. So this is a very rich period, and one of the fun facts about Houston, in terms of Hispanic literature, is that the largest publisher of Hispanic literature is here in Houston. It's called Arte Publico Press, and Arte Publico Press has its headquarters at the University of Houston. So one of the things that the University of Houston is very proud of is exactly that press. And despite the fact that you think of literature as coming from New York City, most of Hispanic literature in the U.S. actually comes from Houston. That was a long way to answer your question, but I wanted to give a kind of big picture of Hispanic literature. Oh, 5 more minutes. Okay. All right. I want to tell you a story then. I'm going to tell you a story about growing up in the barrio. So this is how, and the reason how this came up was because there was an art gallery installation by a Chicana artist, Christine Serrano. And a few years ago, she made a little barrio in the art gallery at Rice, and it really affected me in terms of thinking about growing up in a barrio. So I'm going to read you this story, and it'll take roughly 5 minutes. I went to this exhibit because I was curious to see what this Chicana from LA had to say about barrios. My barrio, in particular, Magnolia. When I walked through the installation on the night of opening, September 29th, 2011, I was only partially prepared for the small things that would attract the imagination of Serrano. Walking around amid the big replicas of cardboard, paint, and faked photographs, I was caught by surprise for the want of the smallest things. I wanted to see or hear a dog. I wanted to hear a cat. I was so moved by what was going on that I wanted to hear the music of my youth. I looked to hear and bang my mother calling me in for dinner, for I, like Serrano, am a product of the barrio upbringing. But I didn't really know how much I wanted that memory until I walked through her installation. It was and has been inspiring. And now I have a better understanding of what it meant to grow up in a barrio. Solano gives us a kind of an example of a place that I might have in mind when people immigrated from Mexico. And although my parents moved us from Magnolia when I was 15, Magnolia has always been deep inside me, especially the small things like our neighbor. Our neighbor, Senor Cervantes, prized peaches, or our other neighbor, Benito Corona's really knobbly pears, or that vicious dog that lived across the street that always looked for ways to get loose and bite things. I think they called him Pinky. They always had it changed to this huge husk of a tire from an 18-wheeler. It wasn't a dog, but a monster. At least that's how I called him as a child. A dog was the dog we grew up with when we lived in one of Senor Cervantes' small houses. Rusty was his dog, was the dog. But my brothers and I played with him all the time. Then one day, my parents decided, like many immigrants who came from Mexico, they always had this dream of going back to Mexico. And one day we'd leave for Mexico for a while, only to return to the dream of America and Magnolia. Then on another day after our return, and Mom and Dad had settled down by then to buy a house on Avenue F, we paid our respects to Mr. Cervantes, who lived on Avenue K. And there was Rusty wagging his tail like there was no tomorrow. He was happy, we were happy, Senor Cervantes was happy too. So after a while, we leave in Dad's 1965 Ford Galaxy 500, turning left on 75th, heading south towards Canal, where my brothers and I hear the pitter-patter of paws scraping off the asphalt and the red brick beneath that. We turn, standing up on our knees, riding the bumps of 75th. Seatbelts were for the future. There were no seatbelts in 1968. There were no laws. There were seatbelts, but there were no laws. We were for a change happily ignorant of the coming restraints. Papa, it's Rusty. He's following us. Stop. But Dad thought that the best way to deal was a dog gone crazy, because my dad was this way. A dog that voluntarily would leave his home of food and shelter and to chase down a car at 25 miles an hour was to outrun it. So my dad went faster. There we go, dog versus car, 30 miles an hour and 35 miles an hour. The one thing Dad hated more than crazy dogs was a ticket for a moving violation. So 35 miles an hour was the upper limit. Rusty must have seen the chariot races in this old movie called Ben-Hur, like we did, because he was just like Charlton Heston, jumping over ditches, avoiding the cherry red Chevy pickup truck, ignoring the yells from the kids in the days of our elementary school. Rusty was determined to catch us. Papa, he's not giving up. Suddenly I'm torn in my loyalties to my father, oldest son born to immigrant parents. I who learned to speak English from watching TV, who did his best to mind his brothers when Dad was at work and Mom was cleaning, cooking, planning for the future in the house. To me came the responsibility of honoring and respecting my father's wishes and fulfilling my mother's dreams. To me it came to be my father's lieutenant, come hell or high water. But there's Rusty, mixed mongrel of white and red-brown patches. Rusty, the king of unconditional dog love, risking life and limb because love and memory compel him to do so. Love and memory, just like I was taught at Sunday school at Michael Heart of Mary. Taught about Christ who died for our sins so we could have eternal life. Love and memory, that's what I thought about Rusty. That sickly, sweet smell of incense, holy water, faith, and sorrow when you enter the church. Love and memory. Buying raffle tickets and tamales at the church Jamaicas, chasing and being chased between stalls, hiding behind the little red brick school that would soon become my school, where Sister Jean learns to love me to teach Mass, and where Sister Nicholas, another barrio product, loves to teach me words and music, where Miss Caesar, with her Louisiana smile, teaches me that black and brown can love. Where one day the sixth graders will sing when the moon is in the seventh house and Jupiter aligns with Mars in the cafeteria at night, and later dance to ride a penny pony, let the spinning wheel spin. Where Sister Mary John Anthony will remind us daily that we are all God's children even when we're rowdy. The past, present, and future and more came to me and willed me to pray the obvious as we neared the intersection of 75th and Canal. Dear God, please, Lord, don't let Rusty get run over. By 9 years of age, I had seen my share of street dog tragedy in Magnolia. How sad, how lonely these dead dogs made me feel. It always made me feel sad. Please, Lord, protect Rusty. He doesn't know what he does. and I closed my eyes, wincing my ears shut so I couldn't hear the cliche screeching of tires or that hollow bump sound against defenseless dog flesh. And nothing, Rusty, still following us. Just 2 blocks to go, I see the finishing line just as clearly as I see Rusty transform into Steve McQueen, an old famous movie star. He's a combination of McQueen's POW character in The Great Escape, the detective in the movie Bullet, and of course the race car driver from Lamont. Is it that a smirk that I see on his face? Can dogs smirk? Are dogs confident because they can tell the future? Rusty knew once we turned right on Avenue F that he had my dad. My dad slows down, having had his own run-ins as a kid with cars and other moving objects in Monterrey. My dad was loath to hit anything or anyone. Dad lets out a sign, or 1 and 2, and he says, "Perro loco, y ahora qué? ¿Qué vamos a hacer?" Indeed, what are we going to do? As soon as Dad shut the engine off in the driveway, and Rusty is jumping up and down to take a peek at us through the window, my brothers and I showered my dad with, "Can we keep him? Can we keep him?" Soon enough, Mom comes out of the house with a bowl of water. "Perro loco, pura suerte, que nada pasó." Rusty loves and laps his water, and me and my brothers wag our tails, petting and growling at Rusty. "Such a good dog, such a good dog. You know you're a good dog." Rusty stays with us the rest of the day and the next day, but not the day that followed. It wouldn't have been fair to Senor Cervantes, who Rusty loved so much. So we all agreed it's for the best. Besides my brothers and I, and my dad and Mom knew that the damage had already been done. Our new house needed something. It also needed a little girl. So one day our sister Laura was born, and not long after that we get our first puppy, all white with great patches. My brother names him Pinto, and we love him too. Rusty did us a big favor that Saturday morning. Mom and Dad had followed the Mexican dream of working people moving north to make a little money, only to hope to return home one day to be totally Mexican again. So they tried that long summer '68. Dad's cousin got him a job in some big chemical plant in Monterrey selling chemicals. Mom cleaned, cooked, and planned for the future in our new stone house. And our Spanish was improving. And our grandparents loved us, and our cousins would chase us. But things happened. Martin Luther King died, Bobby Kennedy died, Cassius Clay would go to jail. The '68 Olympics were brewing trouble in Mexico City. And suddenly Mom noticed that my English, inherited by Captain Kangaroo himself, was disappearing. And so she didn't like that because she was planning also for the future. So to Houston we returned, and it took a few weeks and a few months and living with our cousins and seeing the neighbor's dog die of poison and seeing the different trouble that my cousin and I could get into. And then one day, down the street, this boy named Luppy comes down the street excited and yelling that the Beatles had quit, they had disbanded, and we don't believe him, and we can't believe him because everybody loves the music of Love Me Do, A Hard Day's Night, Strawberry Fields Are Forever. But then one day we leave our cousins, and on another day Rusty chases us, and he chased us. And he chased us until we knew without knowing that we were back home in Magnolia, and the future was in front of us again. And this is what I think of what happened growing up in the barrio. And when we came back from Mexico, we basically decided never to leave again and to make our way to Houston and Texas and the rest of the country and be a part of this great country here. That's it. Thank you so much. You've been great today. I hope you have a rest of a great lunch and afternoon.
So let's give Dr. Aranda another ovation, please. Thank you.